A 16-year-old church girl vanished into thin air after choir practice in 1986, leaving behind nothing but questions and a father's shattered faith. 20 years later, Pastor David Coleman would discover that sometimes the dead leave traces in the most unexpected places, and that the truth can be more devastating than the mystery itself. The last notes of How Great Thou Art still echoed through the sanctuary of Millbrook Baptist Church that Wednesday evening in June. Sarah Beth's clear soprano voice lingering in the rafters long after the final amen. She had stayed behind to stack hymnals, her white church shoes clicking against the polished wooden floors as she moved between the pews with practiced efficiency. The other choir members had already scattered into the humid Tennessee twilight, their laughter fading as car doors slammed and engines started in the gravel parking lot. David Coleman had been in his study, wrestling with Sunday's sermon about faith in dark times. When he heard the church door close with its familiar groan, he assumed Sarah Beth had finished her duties and walked the 3 blocks home to help Margaret with supper. It wasn't until Margaret called at 9:30, her voice tight with worry, asking if Sarah Beth was still at the church, that the first cold finger of dread touched his heart by morning. Their daughter had simply ceased to exist. Now 2 decades. Later, David stood before the dusty window of Second Chance's thrift store on Millbrook's Main Street, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at a pair of white leather shoes. Displayed among the faded wedding dresses and chipped china, the afternoon sun slanted through the store's grimy windows, casting everything in sepia tones that made the past feel uncomfortably present. The shoes were unmistakably Sarah Beth's 7, with the small scuff mark on the left toe from when she'd stumbled during Easter service, and the worn spot on the right heel where she'd favored that foot after twisting her ankle, but it was the faded inscription inside the right shoe, visible through the slightly open tongue, that made his hands tremble against the window glass. SBC. Psalms 23-4, in Margaret's careful script. Written there before Sarah Beth's first youth retreat. David's throat constricted as 20 years of carefully constructed acceptance crumbled in an instant. He had buried his daughter 1,000 times in his mind, had preached about letting go and trusting God's plan until the words felt like sawdust in his mouth. But now, staring at these impossible artifacts of her vanishing, he realized he had never truly believed she was gone. The bell above the thrift store door chimed as he pushed inside, his pastor's composure finally beginning to crack. David sat in his study, the white church shoes positioned on his desk like evidence in a trial that had never ended. 20 years of accumulated obsession surrounded him and Ella folders stuffed with police reports, yellowed newspaper clippings, and photographs of Sarah Beth that seemed to watch him from every surface. The room had become a shrine to his failure, a monument to the one soul he couldn't shepherd home. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her graying hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn since their daughter's disappearance. She held a cup of coffee, though her hands trembled slightly as she took in the scene before her. "You went to that thrift store," she said, her voice carrying the weary resignation of someone who had fought this battle too many times. "I can see it in your face." David looked up from the case file he'd been reviewing for the 1,000th time. "They're hers, Margaret, the shoes. I found them, David." She stepped into the room, carefully avoiding the stacks of papers that had multiplied like weeds over the years. "We've been through this before. Remember the jacket in Nashville? The necklace in Memphis? They were never hers. This is different." He turned the right shoe over, revealing the faded inscription. "Look at what you wrote inside. SBC, Psalms 23-4. You remember writing that, don't you?" Margaret's face crumpled slightly, but she straightened her shoulders with the determination of a woman who had learned to armor herself against hope. "I wrote those same words in dozens of shoes for church trips. Half the girls in Tennessee probably have that verse in their footwear." The scuff mark from Easter service. David stopped, her voice cracked like a whip. "I can't do this anymore. I won't do this anymore." The silence stretched between them, filled with 20 years of accumulated resentment and divergent grief. Margaret had chosen survival. David had chosen penance. People's children. He had retired from the pulpit at 55, unable to preach about God's love when his own prayers felt like stones thrown into an empty well. "She's out there," he whispered, his voice hoarse with conviction. "I can feel it. She's dead, David." Margaret's words fell like hammer blows. "Our daughter is dead, and you're killing our marriage by refusing to accept it." David stared at his hands, noting how they'd aged while he wasn't paying attention. Pastor's hands, once steady enough to comfort the grieving, now shook with his own unresolved anguish. "I was supposed to protect her," he said. "I was her father, her pastor. I failed at both." Margaret set down her coffee and moved toward the door. "You're failing at being my husband, too," the bell above Second Chance's door announced. David's return with the same cheerful chime that had welcomed him the day before. But now the sound felt urgent, almost accusatory. Behind the counter, Estelle Hawkins looked up from sorting through, a box of costume jewelry, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, streaming through the store's front windows. Back again, Pastor Coleman. She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew why he'd returned. "I figured you might be." David approached the counter with Sarah Beth's shoes clutched in a paper bag, his pastoral training warring with his desperation. He had spent his career counseling patience and faith, but 20 years of both had left him hollow. "Mrs. Hawkins, I need to know where these came from, please." Estelle's weathered hands stilled on the jewelry box. She had run Second Chances for 15 years, long enough to recognize the difference between casual curiosity and the kind of need that could consume a person. "Those shoes mean something to you. They belonged to my daughter." David placed the bag on the counter between them. Sarah Beth Coleman. She disappeared 20 years ago. Estelle's expression softened with recognition. "I remember when that happened. Whole town was turned upside down looking for that sweet girl." She paused, studying David's face. "But these shoes, they could belong to anyone." "No," David opened the bag and withdrew the right shoe, turning it to reveal the faded inscription. "My wife wrote this before Sarah Beth's first youth retreat, the scuff mark here, from when she stumbled during Easter service. I know these shoes like I know my own heartbeat." Estelle lifted the shoe with careful hands, squinting at the inscription through her reading glasses. Her silence stretched long enough for David to hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. "I keep records," she said finally. "Every donation, every purchase, have to for tax purposes." She moved toward a filing cabinet behind the counter, her movements deliberate and cautious. "But Pastor, sometimes it's better not to know. Sometimes the mystery is kinder than the truth." "I've lived with mystery for 20 years, David replied. "It's nearly killed me." Estelle pulled out a worn ledger and flipped through pages with the practiced efficiency of someone who had organized other people's discarded lives. "Here, donated 3 weeks ago by Pauline Hutchins. Lives out on Route 9, past the old Miller farm." David scribbled the name and address on the back of a church bulletin he'd found in his pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins. You don't know what this means. I might know more than you think." Estelle closed the ledger with a soft thud. Ray Morrison used to come in here sometimes, after he retired, always looking through the donations like he was searching for something. "You might want to give him a call before you go knocking on doors." Ray Morrison's voice crackled through David's cell phone as he sat in his car outside the church, staring at the familiar brick facade where his daughter had last been seen alive. "I remember that case like it was yesterday, Pastor. Still keeps me up some nights. Ray, I found something." David's grip tightened on the phone. Sarah Beth's shoes turned up in a thrift store. "I need to know what we missed 20 years ago." Long pause. "Meet me at the church in an hour. There's things I never told you back then. Things I probably should have now." David pushed through the heavy oak doors, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon oil and old hymnals. Ray Morrison waited in the front pew, his retirement having added weight to his frame but sharpened the intelligence in his eyes. He held a manila folder that looked disturbingly similar to the ones cluttering David's study. "You kept investigating," David said, settling beside the man who had officially closed Sarah Beth's case 5 years earlier, never stopped. Ray opened the folder revealing photographs and interview notes. "Just couldn't do it openly anymore. Department moved on. But I couldn't." He pulled out a faded photograph of the church sanctuary, taken the night Sarah Beth disappeared. "Look at this. See anything different?" David studied the image, his pastor's eye cataloging every detail of his own church. "The piano bench is pulled out. Sarah Beth never left it like that. She was meticulous about putting everything back in place." That's what I thought too. Ray flipped to another page. And here's something else. Brother Thomas's car was still in the parking lot when the first patrol arrived, but he claimed he'd left right after practice ended. The memory surfaced on Biden Brother Thomas stepping out of the church basement that night, guitar case in hand, his youth minister's smile bright as always. David had been so focused on his sermon, so trusting of the man who had brought such energy to their youth program. You suspected, Thomas, David's voice barely qualified as a whisper. I suspected everyone back then had to. But Thomas, Ray's jaw tightened. Whispers from some of the older girls about him being too friendly, too interested in private counseling sessions. But every time I tried to follow up, the girls would clam up, said they'd been misunderstood. David felt the familiar sanctuary, walls pressing in around him. Brother Thomas had been his protege, the earnest young seminary graduate who'd transformed their youth ministry. The congregation had loved him, especially the teenage girls who'd hung on his every word during Bible study. Where is he now? David asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Ray's expression darkened. That's the thing, Pastor. 3 months after Sarah Beth disappeared, Brother Thomas packed up and left town, said God was calling him to mission work overseas. No forwarding address, no references requested, just vanished, same as your daughter. The gravel road to Pauline Hutchins' farmhouse kicked up dust clouds that hung in the still air like smoke signals, marking their passage through the rolling hills outside Millbrook. Ray Morrison gripped the passenger seat of David's pickup truck as they navigated the rutted driveway, his retired detective's eyes already cataloging details: the overgrown garden, the sagging porch, the way the curtains twitched closed as they approached. 20 years changes people, Ray said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Makes them forget things they don't want to remember, or remember things that never happened at all. Pauline Hutchins answered their knock with the wariness of someone who had learned to distrust unexpected visitors. She was a small woman, perhaps 70, with steel gray hair and eyes that held too many secrets. When Ray showed his identification and explained their purpose, her face closed like a door slamming shut. I don't know nothing about any shoes, she said, already moving to close the door. Mrs. Hutchins, please. David stepped forward, his pastoral training kicking in. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know where those shoes came from. They belonged to my daughter. Something flickered in her eyes' recognition, perhaps, or fear. Your daughter, Sarah Beth Coleman. She disappeared from our church 20 years ago. Pauline's hand trembled on the doorknob. I remember hearing about that. Terrible thing. She paused, glancing nervously between them. Those shoes, they were in a box of things I've been meaning to get rid of. Belonged to my late husband's sister, Clara. She passed last spring, Clara. Kept those shoes for 20 years. Ray's tone suggested he wasn't buying the explanation. Clara was a pack rat. Kept everything. Pauline's voice grew defensive. Had boxes of clothes from decades past. I've been donating them bit by bit. David felt his hope deflating like a punctured tire. Another dead end, another false lead in 20 years of false leads, but something in Pauline's manner, the way she avoided eye contact. The slight tremor in her voice suggested there was more to the story. Mrs. Hutchins, he said gently, if there's anything else you can tell us, anything at all, it would mean the world to me. She stood silent for a long moment, her weathered hands working at her apron. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above. A whisper. Clara used to clean for some folks in town, before she got too old and sick. She'd bring home things sometimes, clothes, that were going to be thrown away, she said, but, double quotes, but what? Ray leaned forward. I always wondered if maybe she took things that weren't meant to be taken. She had problems toward the end, you understand? Her mind wasn't right. David's pulse quickened. Who did she clean for? Pauline's face went pale. Brother Thomas? She cleaned his house every Thursday for near on 15 years. The abandoned Camp Galilee sat like a rotting tooth in the Tennessee mountains, its wooden buildings gray with age and neglect. David's truck climbed the winding dirt road that had once carried busloads of eager church youth to summer retreats, but now lead only to memories and decay. Brother Thomas had purchased the property in 1985, claiming God had called him to create a sanctuary for spiritual renewal. Haven't been up here in years, Ray said, studying the collapsing dining hall through the windshield. County condemned it back in '95, but Thomas never bothered to tear it down. An old man emerged from behind the chapel, his movements stiff, with arthritis but his eyes sharp with recognition. Earl Macready had been the camp's groundskeeper for 30 years, one of the few people who remembered the property's hideout, its darker secrets. "Thought I might see you folks eventually," Earl said, wiping his hands on a dirty cloth. "Heard through the grapevine that someone was asking questions about Brother Thomas again." David felt his throat constrict. "Again. FBI came through here about 10 years back. Real quiet-like, asking about the youth programs. Looking through the old cabin records." Earl's weathered face creased with disgust. Should have known something was wrong back then. Way that man would pick favorites among the girls, always finding reasons for private prayer sessions. Ray pulled out his notebook. What kind of sessions? Counseling, he called it. Special discipleship for the more mature girls, Earl spat, into the weeds. Always the pretty ones, always the ones who were having trouble at home. Sarah Beth Coleman was his latest project that summer before she disappeared. David's world tilted sideways. Sarah Beth came to the camp. Sure did. July of '86, just a month before she vanished. Thomas brought her up here for what he called intensive spiritual guidance. Said she was struggling with doubt, needed one-on-one mentoring. Earl's voice grew heavy with regret. I should have said something then, but who was I to question a man of God? The three men stood in the shadow of the chapel, its cross now tilted at a mournful angle. David could picture his daughter here, 16 and vulnerable, seeking guidance from a man she trusted. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. "Earl," Ray said carefully, "did you ever see anything inappropriate between Thomas and the girls?" The old groundskeeper's silence stretched long enough for a hawk to cry overhead, its call echoing off the mountain walls like a warning. "Enough," he said finally. "Saw enough to know that some shepherds are really wolves." David closed his eyes, feeling 20 years of misplaced trust crumble into dust. His daughter hadn't simply vanished. That night she had been led into darkness by someone who spoke in the language of light. The first door slammed in David's face belonged to Helen Crawford, who had served as church secretary during Brother Thomas's tenure. Through the screen door's mesh, her eyes held the wild panic of someone whose carefully constructed world was under siege. "I don't know what you're trying to accomplish, David Coleman," she said, her voice shrill with defensiveness. "But Brother Thomas was a godly man who helped dozens of young people find their way to Christ. Helen, please. I just need to know if you ever noticed anything." "I noticed a dedicated youth minister who worked miracles with troubled teenagers. Now get off my porch before I call the police." The pattern repeated itself across Millbrook like a virus of willful blindness. At the Henderson split-level ranch, former Deacon Charlie Henderson claimed his memory was fuzzy about those years. "Lot of water under the bridge, Pastor. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Mary Beth Parker, who had chaperoned youth trips, suddenly remembered urgent errands. When David knocked through her kitchen window, he could see her pressing herself against the far wall, waiting for him to leave. By the time David reached the church that evening, his frustration had curdled into something darker. Pastor Williams waited in the fellowship hall, his young face already bearing the careful neutrality that David recognized from his own years in ministry. The expression used when protecting the institution mattered more than protecting the truth. "David, I understand you're hurting," Pastor Williams said, his tone measured and professionally sympathetic. "But you're stirring up painful memories for a lot of people. The church has healed from that tragedy. We've moved forward." "Moved forward?" David's voice echoed off the fellowship hall's walls. "My daughter is still missing, and you're worried about the church's reputation. I'm worried about you." Pastor Williams straightened, his pastoral authority settling around him like armor. "This obsession isn't healthy. It's not what Sarah Beth would have wanted." The presumption hit David like a physical blow. "Don't you dare tell me what my daughter would have wanted." "The deacon board has asked me to speak with you," Pastor Williams continued, his voice gaining strength. "If you continue this, investigation. They feel it might be best if you found another church home for everyone's healing." David stared at the man who had taken his pulpit, his congregation, and now presumed to exile him from the sanctuary where his daughter had last drawn breath. The church that had raised him, married him, ordained him, was now closing ranks against him, like antibodies rejecting a foreign threat. "You all knew," David said, the words coming out like stones. "You knew about Thomas, and you let him leave quietly rather than face the truth." Pastor Williams's silence was answer enough. Brother Thomas's old house crouched on Maple Street like a guilty secret, its white paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. David and Ray approached the front porch, where Marcus Thomas, a thin man in his 30s, waited with the nervous energy of someone expecting bad news. "Uncle Tom left me this place when he passed," Marcus said, fumbling with his keys. "Been meaning to fix it up, but there's something about it that gives me the creeps. Maybe it's all those religious books he left behind, or the way the basement door won't stay shut." Ray exchanged a glance with David. "Your uncle died. When— "Oh, he's not dead," Marcus laughed nervously. "I mean, he's alive, but living in some nursing home up in Kentucky. Alzheimer's got him bad. Hasn't recognized anyone in years." He pushed open the front door, releasing the stale air of abandonment. "But he's as good as dead to the family." We don't talk about Uncle Tom much. The house's interior felt frozen in time 1980s furniture covered in dust sheets, religious artwork lining the walls, and everywhere the oppressive weight of secrets kept too long. David found himself drawn to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Brother Thomas, surrounded by smiling teenagers at what looked like a church picnic. Sarah Beth's face smiled back at him from the second row. "Lot of young people came through here," Marcus said, following David's gaze. Uncle Tom was always mentoring somebody, always helping kids who needed guidance. His voice carried an odd inflection, as if he were reciting words he'd memorized but never believed. Ray was already moving toward the basement door, which stood slightly ajar despite Marcus's claim that it wouldn't stay shut. "Mind if we take a look downstairs?" "I guess, but there's nothing down there except old Sunday school supplies and ... Marcus's voice trailed off as a sound drifted up from Belosoft footsteps, like someone trying to move quietly. The three men froze. Ray's hand instinctively moved toward where his service weapon used to rest, while David felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Marcus Ray said quietly, "Who else has access to this house?" "Nobody. I mean, I gave a key to my girlfriend, Lily, but she's at work." Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Oh, God. Lily's been acting strange lately, scared. She said Uncle Tom had been calling her, talking about coming home. But I thought she was confused because of his condition." From the basement came another sound-a-muffled cry that raised every hair on David's neck. "Call 911. Now." David followed his pastor's instincts, overriding his fear. In the basement's dim light, they found her, a teenage girl, bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror above a strip of duct tape. But it wasn't the girl that made David's blood run cold. It was the man standing in the shadows behind her, very much alive and holding a knife. Brother Thomas smiled. "Hello, Pastor Coleman. I've been expecting you." The basement confrontation had lasted only minutes' rate, tackling Brother Thomas while David freed the girl, but it had revealed a horrifying truth. Thomas wasn't working alone, and Lily wasn't his first recent victim. A hastily scrawled note in Thomas's pocket led them to a remote cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains, where other girls were allegedly being held. Now David crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his breath forming clouds in the mountain air as he watched the cabin through binoculars. Ray had called for backup, but the nearest sheriff's station was 2 hours away through winding mountain roads. The girl they'd rescued, Lily, had been barely coherent, mumbling about the other ones and the man with the scar who helped Brother Thomas. "There's movement in the back window," Ray whispered, his service revolver drawn despite his retirement. "At least 2 figures, maybe more." Brother Thomas emerged onto the cabin's sagging porch, his 70-year-old frame moving with surprising agility. The man David had once trusted with his congregation's youth now appeared as he truly was, a predator who had perfected his hunting ground over decades. Behind him walked a younger man with a jagged scar across his left cheek, his hands resting on the shoulders of a teenage girl who moved with the defeated shuffle of someone who had given up hope. "That's Charlie Henderson's son, Billy," David said, recognizing the scarred man with sick certainty. Deacon Henderson always said Billy was finding his way back to God after his troubles with the law. Looks like he found his way to something else, Ray muttered. How many families in your church were part of this? The question hit David like a physical blow. How many trusted faces had been hiding monsters? How many parents had unknowingly delivered their children into the hands of wolves dressed as shepherds? Brother Thomas called out across the clearing, his voice carrying the same sermonic cadence David remembered from Sunday morning services. Pastor Coleman, I know you're out there. Why don't you come up and we'll discuss this like civilized men? Of God, David started to rise, but Ray grabbed his arm. He's got at least one hostage, probably more. We wait for backup. I can't wait, David said, thinking of Sarah Beth, of 20 years of not knowing. Of all the other girls who might be suffering while he hid behind trees, I've been waiting for 20 years. Pastor Coleman. Brother Thomas called again, his voice taking on a mocking sing-song quality. I have something that belongs to you, something you've been looking for. But if you want to see her, you'll have to come up here and face me like a man. Through the cabin's front window, a figure moved, a woman with auburn hair and familiar features. Older now, but unmistakably, the face he'd been searching for in every crowd for 2 decades. Sarah Beth was alive. The woman in the cabin window hadn't. Been Sarah Beth just, another victim with similar features. Her auburn hair dyed to match David's desperate hopes. The mountain confrontation had ended with Brother Thomas and Billy Henderson in custody. 3 girls rescued, but David's daughter remained a ghost haunting the spaces between truth and delusion. In the sterile corridors of Millbrook General Hospital, David sat beside the bed of Jessica Martinez, 17 years old, who had been held captive for 8 months. Her physical wounds would heal, but her eyes carried the hollow stare of someone who had seen humanity's darkest corners. He talked about your daughter a lot, Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines monitoring her recovery. Said she was his first real success, his prototype. He kept her picture on the cabin wall like some kind of shrine. David's hands trembled as he leaned closer. What did he say about her? Where is she now? Jessica's eyes filled with tears. He said she was perfect. Said she learned to love him the way God intended. But Pastor Coleman, she gripped his hand with surprising strength. He said she was gone. Said she died trying to run away when she was 19, but that her spirit lived on in all of us. The words hit David like hammer blows. 7 years. Sarah Beth had survived 7 years before her final escape attempt. 7 years of hell while he'd prayed for her safe return every night. He excused himself and stumbled into the hallway, where Ray Morrison waited with coffee and the grim expression of a man bearing more bad news. Found something in the church basement, Ray said, handing David a evidence bag containing a tarnished silver locket. Construction crew was doing renovation work for the new pastor when they discovered a hidden room behind the furnace. This was nailed to the wall. David recognized the locket, immediately Sarah Beth's 16th birthday gift from Margaret, engraved with her initials and a tiny cross. His fingers traced the familiar contours through the plastic evidence bag, understanding finally settling. Over him, like a burial shroud, she never left Millbrook, he said, his voice hollow with recognition. He kept her in the church basement all those years, right under our noses. Ray nodded grimly. We found other things too. Personal items from at least 6 different girls, spanning 20 years. The whole church foundation is going to have to be excavated. David closed his eyes, seeing the basement where he'd stored communion supplies and Christmas decorations, never knowing that his daughter was imprisoned just yards away while he preached about God's love to the very man who was destroying her. Brother Thomas is asking to see you, Ray said quietly. Claims he has something important to tell you about Sarah Beth's final days, something only you would understand. David looked through the hospital window at the church steeple visible. In the distance, its cross gleaming in the afternoon sun like a promise he'd never been able to claim. The Millbrook County Courthouse buzzed with tension as David took his seat in the gallery, surrounded by faces he'd known for decades. Some supportive, others carefully neutral, all grappling with the revelation that evil had flourished in their midst for 20 years. Brother Thomas sat at the defendant's table, his once commanding presence diminished by orange prison garb, but his eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had manipulated so many lives. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh stood before the jury, her voice steady as she outlined a pattern of abuse that stretched back decades. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant used his position of trust, his role as a spiritual leader, to prey upon the most vulnerable members of this community. Young girls who came to him seeking guidance found instead a predator who twisted their faith into chains. One by one, the victims took the stand. Jessica Martinez, now stronger but still fragile, described her 8 months of captivity. Amy Patterson, now 32, revealed that Brother Thomas had abused her during youth retreats in the 1990s. Her testimony opening floodgates as other women found the courage to speak. The scope of the conspiracy became clear. Billy Henderson, Charlie Henderson, even respected church elder Frank Morrison had all participated in what prosecutors called a network of systematic abuse. David watched his former congregants testify, each revelation adding another weight to the crushing guilt he carried. How had he missed the signs? How had he celebrated these men as pillars of the community while they destroyed innocent lives? When the defense called Brother Thomas to testify, the courtroom fell silent. The old man approached the witness stand with the measured steps of someone accustomed to commanding attention. And when he spoke, traces of his old sermonic authority still colored his voice. "I loved those girls," he said, his words causing audible gasps from the gallery. "I offered them something their broken families could in unconditional acceptance. Spiritual guidance, a father's love. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, my methods were unorthodox, but everything I did was born of love." David felt bile rise in his throat at the perversion of language he'd once held sacred. When Da Walsh cross-examined Thomas about specific victims, the old man answered with clinical detachment until she mentioned Sarah Beth's name. "Ah, Sarah Beth," Thomas said, his eyes finding David in the gallery. "My greatest success and my deepest regret. She was special, you know, pure, perfect. But in the end, she chose rebellion over redemption." "Where is she now?" Walsh demanded. "Brother?" Thomas smiled with the serene expression David remembered from countless Sunday morning services. "She's in a better place, resting in the arms of the Lord she never truly accepted in life." The courtroom erupted, but David heard nothing over the roaring in his ears. Even now, even facing life in prison, Brother Thomas spoke in riddles and religious platitudes. Holding Sarah Beth's final resting place as his last card to play, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts. On all counts, the cave system behind Camp Galilee had been hidden for decades beneath a tangle of kudzu and fallen timber. Its entrance revealed only when Brother Thomas finally broke his silence in exchange for a plea bargain that would spare him the death penalty. David stood at the mouth of the limestone cavern with Margaret beside him, their hands clasped for the first time in years as the forensic team worked inside. 23 years, Margaret whispered, her voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every birthday marked by absence, every Christmas shadowed by an empty chair. "She's been here all this time, so close we could have found her if we'd just looked in the right place." Ray Morrison emerged from the cave's depths, his face grave but determined. In his hands, he carried a small evidence bag containing a delicate gold bracelet, the one David had given Sarah Beth for her confirmation. Engraved with Psalm 23-4, the same verse Margaret had written in her daughter's church shoes. "All those years ago, we found her," Ray said simply. "She's coming home." The forensic anthropologist's preliminary report would later confirm what David's heart already knew. Sarah Beth had died at 19, just as Brother Thomas had claimed, but she hadn't died trying to escape. The evidence suggested she had been killed when she'd refused to participate in recruiting other girls, when the woman she'd become had finally found the courage to say no to the monster who'd stolen her childhood. 3 days later, Millbrook Baptist Church held its first service since the revelations had shattered the congregation. Pastor Williams had resigned in shame, and the building itself stood empty except for David, Margaret, and the simple wooden casket that finally contained their daughter's remains. David had spent 40 years in ministry, had preached countless sermons about God's plan and the mystery of suffering. But standing in this sanctuary where Sarah Beth had last sang hymns, he found himself without words. Instead, he simply held Margaret's hand and listened to the silence that had haunted them for more than 2 decades. "She's free now," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Whatever he did to her, however long she suffered, she's finally free." David nodded, understanding that healing wouldn't come quickly or easily. There would be more tears, more sleepless nights, more questions that would never have answers. But for the first time since that June evening in 1986, he felt something that might eventually grow into peace. Outside, the church bells began to toll not in celebration, but in the ancient rhythm of grief, acknowledged and burdens. Finally, shared. Sarah Beth Coleman had come home at last, and her father could finally begin to say goodbye in the distance. Storm clouds gathered over the Tennessee mountains, promising rain that would wash the dust from Sarah Beth's headstone and water the flowers Margaret had planted there. The healing would take time, but it had finally begun.